For Krima Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. Bishop Peter Storey discusses his book titled, I Beg to Differ, Ministry Amid the Teargas. You were most well known for leading the Methodist Church of Southern Africa into what many white congregants saw as uncomfortable political territory. Can you please tell us about your experiences in leading the church into a strong anti-apartheid position?
Well, the Methodist Church took a strong anti-apartheid position some years before I became its leader and had a leadership role. But things, you know, got more and more tense and more intense. And I was in leadership in 1985, really, I think at the height of the tensions within our land and really the height of the war that was going on in our land. And of course, many white Methodists were taken in by the propaganda of the apartheid regime and were very uncomfortable with the position that some of us took as its leaders. And there was a moment really when we felt we had to decide who we were going to be. What did it really mean to be faithful to the gospel in apartheid South Africa? And we gathered Methodist people, black and white, young and old, women and men, clergy and laity, for a week in a gathering that we called Obedience. And in that gathering, we tried to ask the question, what does it mean to follow Jesus? You know, to be obedient. And we told people, if you're going to come to this conference, you have to sign a document, a promise, that no matter how angry you get, you will stay till the end. But right in the middle of that conference, I think one of our very remarkable black ministers, whose name was Wesley Mabuza, he issued a challenge. I don't think many white Methodists had been challenged that way by a black person in their lives. And it was a crisis moment where I think the conference could have broken up, but we got through it. Out of that obedience conference, there came a document, the message of obedience. And that's the document that I was able to take out into every part of our church and say to people, look, if you don't like where we stand, it's not just your bishops and a few other people who have made, this is the decision of the whole church. We wrestled to this decision. Now, this is who we are. This is where we stand. If you don't like it, find another church. And we were able to do that. My own belief is that apartheid would have ended 10 years earlier if it wasn't for cowards in the pulpit. Because this was, certainly in those days, a religious country. It was a country where a vast majority of the population, white and black, were members of the church. And my own belief is that we had too many ministers who were not willing to stand and tell the truth and to show that the emperor was naked. This thing called apartheid had no clothes. It was a lie. And so, you know, if I was able to play any part in advancing that cause, I'm grateful.
What were your first experiences of apartheid as you grew up under the National Party rule?
Well, in the book that I've just written, it actually starts with the story of how I first encountered, if you like, the ugliness of our society. I was a little boy of 10. We lived on a mission station outside Pretoria, where 1,000 young black students were being educated by the Methodist Church, a place called Kilnerton, famous in Pretoria, Johannesburg area because so many teachers came from Kilnerton into the schools of the black townships. And we used to go by train, steam train, into this is interesting, I went to school in town. So even though I lived on an educational institution, a very fine one, we still were not far away enough from the segregation mind. So I was, you know, I went to a white school in town. I'm not proud of that. And when I got off the train that day, as the train pulled out, a whole lot of schoolboys from the Afrikaans Hoërskool. I went to Pretoria Boys High School, the English-speaking school. And they leant out of the window and they were shouting, they were waving flags, they were shouting words like Apartheid kom, Kafferbutti, and all these sort of things. And they spat on me as it passed. And of course, I didn't know what was going on. But the fact is that, that I got off at a station where only black people got off to get to this mission station, this school. And so it had a reputation for being a place which was established for the benefit of blacks. And so I had to go home, a 10-year-old, in tears, covered in other people's spit, and to ask my father, you know, what had I done wrong? And he said, well, this is where black people, Africans, are educated, and that's not something that this new government wants. You see, it was the day of the 1948 election, and the National Party had just come into power that day. And that's why these kids were so, you know, full of sense of triumph. Yeah. That was my introduction to the politics of this country.
Your church hosted a memorial service for Steve Biko in 1977 and also hosted 2,500 railway men during a violent racket strike in 1987. What do you remember about those events?
Well, you know, there's a long tradition in the Christian church of sanctuary, of giving shelter to people who, for whatever reason, are marginalized or oppressed or excluded. And of course, it was very difficult for people in those days to hold protest meetings in public. They were broken up by the police. And so the Central Methodist Mission in Johannesburg, my church, became a sanctuary for gatherings like that. And also for memorial services. And at least you felt that people had some safety within the walls of the church. The one you referred to was a massive strike. It was the railway strike. Yes. And these were railway men who had tried to hold a meeting. It had been broken up, so they came to our church. And the funny thing is that so many of them were rural men, African men, who were carrying knobkerries, you know, traditional weapons. And I was happy to have them, but I wasn't happy to have the weapons. Yeah. So they had to pile the weapons out in the foyer. And heaven knows how they found them afterwards. This is mine, this is mine, this is yours. But finally, we held a meeting in the church, a protest meeting, which was broken up by the right. They came right into the church with their guns. They stood around the communion table, pointing their guns at the congregation, and ordered us, you know, out. And I felt they'd crossed the line that day. I said, I don't mind you coming into the hall downstairs, but now you're in the sanctuary. You're really annoying God. Yes.
And in 1965, a commission for the renewal of the church was set up under the leadership of Alex Borrell.
Yes.
Why was this necessary?
You know, the church is a funny animal. It claims to follow the most radical person who's ever lived. And then it behaves in the most conservative way you could ever think of. And that's what religion does. I don't think Jesus was about religion. He was about new life. He was about justice. He was about integrity. And we keep on turning him into a religion with rules and regulations and boring stuff like that. And the church so often gets obsessed with its own navel. It keeps, you know, looking at its own navel instead of looking out into the world. So a bunch of young ministers, led at that time by Alex Borrell, who was a Methodist minister at that time, we decided we needed to turn the church upside down. So we started working for change within the church, and we made some progress. and brought about, you know, certain changes. For instance, the first time that women came in as ministers was a result of things like that. The first time we began to integrate the circuits of the church, which up to then had been sort of white circuits and African circuits, and so on. So we made some progress through the Renewal Commission, but it wasn't long before we needed another one, again, to kick the church in the pants.
For a time you served Madiba as a chaplain. What are your recollections of this experience?
I was such a young guy, and we didn't know that Robben Island was a political prison. At that time it was just being built. And I just come out the Navy, and I was missing the Navy so much. And somebody said, we need a chaplain for this prison on Robben Island. So I'll go. You know, at least I'll get a ride on a boat. So that's how I got to Robben Island. And of course, I arrived there in '63. And so the first remarkable human being I met there was Robert Sobukwe. And I had, because he lived alone, I was able to spend about an hour with him each time I visited. And I came to know him. I came to respect him. I came to love him. He was also a Methodist lay preacher of deep, deep faith. And so we could skirt around politics because, of course, there was always a guard and you were not allowed to talk politics. And then it was only in '64, mid-'64, that the Rivonia trialists arrived. And, of course, they came under such heavy security that only once I was allowed to meet with them as a group. They were kept locked in their cells. And if you've been there, you may know that there's this long passage with the cells on each side where Mandela and Sisulu and Kathrada and the others were kept. And I had to walk up and down that passage preaching and trying to lead a service of worship. I could look at them through the grill of their cell and try and make eye contact and I think I learned to speak in sound bites, to preach in sound bites, so that I could leave something with each of the prisoners. I was removed from the island. The authorities took away my clearance, my security clearance, so I was kicked off the island at the end of '64. But I was left with this sense of outrage that people of this caliber, people of this quality of character, giants of the human spirit, would be locked up here simply for wanting their people to be treated as human beings. So although I don't know what I left with them, because I was very young and very inexperienced, they left something with me.
You were appointed by Madiba to help select members of the TRC. How did you go about undertaking this task? And what is your view of the impact that the TRC had in our country?
Well, it was interesting to be on the selection committee because there was a representative of each major political party, the IFP, the Nationalist Party, the ANC, and one or two others. And then there were some of us who were non-party, some from, two of us from the churches, and a couple of, a trade unionist, and somebody from Lawyers for Human Rights. And what happened was that each of these party people came with their list, who the boss of their party said, you know, you better have these on the list. And of course the others opposed them. So they kind of checkmated each other. They didn't trust each other at all. And so that gave us a chance to put in names that were not politically loaded, that names of people who had an independent integrity, if you like. You know, if you can't get the one you really want, you're not going to let the other one get his one. And so rather let's take one that will be fair to both sides. And so I think we did a fairly good job of selecting a group of people with integrity. One or two of them were compromises in the end. I won't name any names, and I was disappointed with one or two of them. But your second question, I think, is such an important one. How do we view the Truth Commission? These days, it's very fashionable, particularly by a much younger generation, to sort of rubbish the Truth Commission, that it was a hypocritical process. That's nonsense. It was a profoundly deep and life-changing experience for the people involved. It did have its design faults, if you like, the Truth Commission. But nowhere in human history so far had warring parties agreed to come together and be honest about the places where they broke the rules. Now, some people say, well, they weren't equal. The evil wasn't, of course the evil wasn't equal. If you look at the Truth Commission report, 6 volumes of it, it's very clear about where the weight of the evil lay. But the fact that people, even on the good side, the good guys, had to also at least declare places where they had failed to act humanely was, I think, very important. And I've often said the Truth Commission did not fail South Africa. South Africans failed the Truth Commission. They did it in a number of ways. Whites would not participate. They kept arm's length, and they are paying the price now. We whites, instead of getting engaged in the Truth Commission, instead of learning from it about the things that we did and the attitudes we had, we kept back. And black South Africans noticed that. They were not impressed. They were saying, look, we're going to meet you more than halfway, and you don't want to come to the party. And so we mustn't moan now when we think whites are being marginalized. We had a chance to roll up our sleeves, to acknowledge our faults, and to get engaged in building a new South Africa. Very few whites did that. The second failure for me was by the churches. I think the Truth Commission should have gone into every village and dorp and township of the country. Only the churches, religious bodies, have got agencies in all those places. And you know, you've got to go to other parts of the world to realize how unique this TRC was. You go to other parts of the world and they say, did you really do that? Did you really do that? How could you possibly have managed it? And you have to say, well, Africa's a special place.
You were surprised when Dr. Faisal Randera requested that the church host hearings at the Central Methodist Mission. Why were you surprised?
When Faisal came to me and asked that question, I was very touched. But I thought he was talking about the hall downstairs in the basement.
You were worried about the aircon.
I thought, no, it's going to be crowded out, the aircon, the toilet's going to break down. So I said, it's not a good spot. No, he said, the church, we want to go into the church. But I said, how can you ask? I mean, there will be people who are Hindus, Muslims, people of different faiths. They're going to come and talk about the most painful experiences in their lives. Is it fair to ask them to do that in a sanctuary which has sort of the symbols of one particular religion in it? And that's when he said to me, you know, you forget, this was not a strange place to us. This was our shelter. This was our sanctuary. This is where we came for our protests and to grieve. And I felt very moved. When he left me, I almost, you know, there were a few tears on my face because I thought to myself, God, you asked us to be something in this struggle, and it seems we were.
You also worked closely with Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Reverend Frank Chikane. What work brought you together with these individuals?
Well, the SACC, the South African Council of Churches, it was the person who actually nominated Desmond Tutu to be the General Secretary. And we elected him, and he came out of Lesotho, where he was a bishop, and came into the sort of cauldron of engagement with the political issues and so on. And so I became the president of the SACC, and he was the general secretary. So that threw us together in all sorts of ways. And we found ourselves traveling together and going to pretty hot places, like Namibia, to look at some of the atrocities which the SADF was committing there, and to try and expose them, and other places. And I came to know this man, to whom I think South Africa will never know how much we owe to Desmond Tutu. I think he and Madiba were both given to us as an amazing gift at the time we needed that kind of leadership most. Because I think it's so important. Now I'm going to speak as a preacher. It's so important for us to realize that apartheid and all it did was not just a political issue. It was a spiritual issue. It was a disease of the heart. It was not just a political policy. It was actually a pathology of the human spirit. It was about being sick instead of being whole. And Desmond appreciated that very, very clearly. He saw the theological significance of apartheid. And so when we were put on trial as the SACC by the Elof Commission, and we had to give evidence, he and I both gave the evidence in chief for the SACC. We were both interrogated for 20 hours or so at that commission. But when Desmond gave his introducing statement, his introductory statement, opening statement, it was about 4 hours long, he was preaching. He took this poor judge and these other commissioners who were there to punish us. He took them through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. He gave them the longest Bible study I've ever heard. And he made it very, very clear that this thing called apartheid was not just bad politics, not just unjust politics. It was an insult to the Creator who made us in his image. And that was his power. That was his power. His power was to point people to the spiritual consequences and implications of these evil policies. What they were doing to our souls, our characters. They were eroding our humanity.
You also attended the funeral of young Storey Seipe in Paris after that mysterious occasion that happened in the 80s. How did you respond to the allegations that were leveled against your priest now, Paul Verheyen, by
Winnie,
the late Mandela?
Well, you know, that has to rank for me as one of the most painful times in my ministry, because I, as Bishop of Soweto area, had to confront the fact that some young people, including Stompie, had been kidnapped, taken from a church sanctuary and shelter, and then beaten to within an inch of their lives in the backyard of Mrs. Mandela, and that she had been involved. I don't have any doubt about that. I know it. And that one of them had vanished, and we weren't sure whether he was still alive. The others were still held there. And the members of the community, and I worked very closely with the community leaders because I think it was important to do so. The members of the community who went to try and talk to her about this got nowhere. And there was a real danger that A, Stompie was dead, that B, the remaining hostages were truly hostages. They were being held hostage. And they were very, very badly wounded. And would they come out alive? And if we pushed too hard to try and get them, would the same thing would they vanish as well? If we didn't, what would happen? And so it was just, I don't like remembering it. I have described it in incredible detail in the book because I kept a very careful daily record of what happened. But to me, it's a supreme example of the South African tragedy. And when the Truth Commission hearings took, well, let me respond to your question about Reverend Paul Verheyen. Of course, when anyone makes suggestions that one of our clergy might have been involved in forms of sexual abuse, we would have to take it very, very seriously, which I did. And so, as a sort of parallel exercise, while we were trying to rescue these boys from her home, we were also holding meetings to try and establish what had happened, and also the guilt or innocence of Reverend Verheyen. And we reached a point where I was satisfied from the testimony of the young men who lived in that house that these charges were empty, that they were groundless, the charges against him. But he suffered by reputation for a long time before his name was sort of finally cleared. Yeah, and ultimately there were the Truth Commission hearings. Those boys were finally released into my care, and we got them back, but we never got Stompie back, and so I had to preach at his funeral. I had to go and tell his mother about it. And it was one of the most painful things. I can remember trying to talk to the mother of a child of 14 who had been killed not by the apartheid system, but through the actions of an icon of the struggle. How do you deal with that? It's not an easy one to deal with. And so at the Truth Commission, as part of my statement, I said, you know, when you have a thing like apartheid, a cancer like apartheid in society, secondary cancers emerge. And sometimes, tragically, we can become a little bit like the very people who oppress us. And we can take on, if you like, the same methods and so on. I don't know if anybody will ever truly be able to explain the what led Winnie to act like that. There are theories, of course, and some of them are quite feasible, I guess, but I don't know which one is the truth. And for me, it was very important throughout that drama, whatever people were doing with Winnie and saying about Winnie, and throughout the drama, it was for me to remember the face of that child and to say the victim was not Winnie, the victim was that child. And any struggle actions which end up by taking the life of a 14-year-old child need to be questioned and challenged.
And lastly, do you think that the churches, especially the South African Council of Churches, are playing a significant role in our democratic South Africa?
Ja, nee. You know, the Afrikaners will say ja, nee. Because I think after 1994, many church leaders made the mistake of thinking that when Madiba came along, the kingdom of God had arrived as well. You know, that when the democratic government equals the kingdom of God, kingdom of peace has arrived, and justice. That's not quite right. there's always going to be a tension between what God wants for the world and what politicians want for themselves and for their people. And so during the apartheid regime, it was very clear who the enemy was, and this gap between God and Caesar was clear, a clear line. Now comes a Caesar, who's a wonderful guy, the best Caesar any country's had in years, in centuries. A guy by the name of Mandela. And I think a lot of church leaders got kind of carried away and said, it's wonderful now, we don't have to in any way, hold the government accountable and so on. And I remember we used to ban the flag in our church. Methodist church, you're not allowed to bring the South African flag into the Methodist church. We said, no, that's Caesar's banner. This is God's house. We don't want any confusion as to who is in charge here. And then came 94 and the new flag. And the people said, can't we bring this one? And we said, no. And they said, but why not? I said, the old one was all stained with evil, but this one is beautifully clean. And we said, just you wait. Just you wait. Well, we know now, 20 years down the track, things have happened in the name of our government, which are disgusting and disgraceful. In fact, for a number of years, our president betrayed everything that we fought for and stood for. So there was a period in which I think our church leaders were silent. Some of them said, we've got to give the new government a chance, Others of them said, but these are our people, these are our people. How can we? And the truth is, the church has to keep, even if the Archangel Gabriel is the president of the country, the church must keep an arm's length from political leadership so that we have what I call a critical distance, a prophetic distance. We will be there to support and applaud everything that our government does to enrich the lives of our people. But when they act as they have, in such a disgraceful manner, it's coming out how utterly diseased our leaders have become. Mandela said in a speech, the churches are there to hold us accountable. Never let us get away. If we do something wrong, tell us. We need to hear it. And I think the Zuma years have resurrected the South African Council of Churches and its prophetic voice. And that, I think, is a reason to celebrate.
That was Bishop Peter Storey speaking to Crema Media's Polity about his book titled I Beg to Differ, Ministry Amid the Tear Gas.